I didn't speak. Not when my mother clanked her wine glass and the room went quiet. Not when she looked at me across the table and said with a smile so warm it could have fooled anyone, "And this is my daughter. She's between jobs right now, you know how it is." Not even when my aunt's husband leaned over and whispered something to his son, and they both laughed. Just soft enough to pretend they hadn't. I just picked up my fork. "My name is Hazel. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a split-level house in Barrie, Ontario. The kind of house where the carpet in the basement never quite dried after a flood we had in 2008, and nobody ever replaced it. And somehow that became normal. There were 2 daughters in our family. My older sister was Simone, and from the time I was old enough to understand what comparison meant, I understood that I was the other one. Not the wrong one, exactly. My parents never said that out loud. They were too careful for that. But there's a version of dismissal that doesn't need words. It lives in where you sit at the table, in whose report card gets put on the fridge with a magnet versus whose gets folded into a kitchen drawer, in the way a mother can ask, "How are you?" and somehow not actually want to know. Simone was a pharmacist, or she was training to be one. She'd been in school for a long time by then. She'd had her Shoppers Drug Mart practicum, her placement in Sudbury, her apartment funded by my parents while she finished her rotations. She was smart, genuinely smart, and I never blamed her for being the one they chose. I blamed them for making it a choice at all. I was 20 when I started cleaning houses, not because I was failing at something else. I want to say that clearly because the story my mother told was always that I dropped out, given up, couldn't handle university. The truth is that I finished a 2-year business administration diploma at Georgian College and then discovered that the entry-level marketing jobs I'd applied for all wanted 3 to 5 years of experience, which is a joke that stops being funny after the 6th rejection. A woman my mother knew through her church had a cleaning company, asked if I wanted to pick up some shifts. I needed money. I said yes. That was the version my mother never told anyone. The version she told was that Hazel had gotten a bit lost. Hazel was still figuring things out, said with a tilt of the head that made it sound like a diagnosis. I worked for that cleaning company for 8 months, learned more about people in those 8 months than I had in my entire previous life. You find out who someone actually is when you're cleaning their bathroom. You learn how they treat people who are invisible to them. I was invisible to almost everyone I cleaned for, and I watched carefully and I filed everything away. Then I quit and started my own company. That part happened slowly and then all at once, the way those things do. I had 12 clients by the end of my first year, a small business loan from the BDC that I repaid 14 months early, a coworker named Deb who I'd met during those 8 months, who was 10 years older than me and had been trying to go out on her own for years, but couldn't do the bookkeeping side. We became partners. She handled the cruise. I handled the cruise. I handled the contracts, the client relationships, the growth. By the time I was 28, we had 23 employees. I didn't tell my family. That's the part people always find hard to believe. But you have to understand what it was like to go home. Calling my mother on a Sunday wasn't a conversation. It was an audit. "How's work? Is that going anywhere? Have you thought about going back to school?" She never asks with cruelty. She asks with the patient, slightly disappointed tone of someone who had already decided the answer was no. So I stopped telling her things, not out of spite, out of self-preservation. I built my life in a completely separate compartment from my family, and for a few years, it worked. Deb knew everything. My best friend Celeste knew everything. My accountant knew everything. My mother knew nothing. Simone knew I owned a cleaning company. She'd found out through a cousin at some point. She never mentioned it to me directly, but once, on a call with my mother that I wasn't supposed to be on, I heard her say, "Well, she cleans houses for a living," in a tone that made it clear she thought that was the end of the sentence. The Christmas dinner was my mother's idea. Big family gathering. First time in 4 years since my grandmother had gotten sick and everything had felt off schedule. My aunt and uncle were driving up from Oakville. My cousin and her husband were flying in from Calgary. My grandmother, who was 82 and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, was being driven in from her retirement home in Orillia. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. I stood in my apartment in Collingwood on the 23rd of December and I thought very seriously about texting my mother that I had a stomach thing and couldn't make it. I had done it before. It was easier. But my grandmother had called me 2 weeks earlier and said, in her particular way that was both gentle and immovable, "I would really like to see you, Hazel." And I couldn't say no to her. So I drove down. My mother's house smelled like pine and roast and something sweet from the oven, the way it always did at Christmas, and for about 40 seconds when I walked in, I felt something close to okay. My grandmother hugged me first. She held on longer than anyone else ever did and said quietly, close to my ear, "You look wonderful." She meant it. She always meant it. Then I came into the living room and my aunt looked up and smiled and said, "Oh, Hazel, still doing the cleaning thing?" Not mean. Just the way you'd ask someone if they still had a particular hobby. "I run a company," I said. "Right, right." She nodded and turned back to my uncle. Dinner was set for 6. By 5:30, everyone was in the living room with wine, and my mother was in her element, moving through the room, filling glasses, narrating everyone to each other. This was where she was genuinely happy, I think. Hosting, being the center of something. I sat near my grandmother and we talked about a book she'd been reading, a mystery set in Edinburgh. And for a while, I forgot to be tense. Then my mother called everyone to the table. There were 9 of us. My parents, me, Simone, my aunt and uncle, my cousin and her husband, and my grandmother. My mother had done place cards, which she always did, and I found mine between my grandmother and my cousin's husband, whose name was Patrick, and who sold insurance and wanted to talk about it. We were 3 minutes into the meal when my mother raised her glass. "I just want to say," she started, and the table went quiet in that automatic way it does when someone's about to give a toast, "how grateful I am to have everyone here. It has been such a year." She paused. She looked around the table. Simone finished her licensure. We are so proud. A full pharmacist now. Her own dispensary in Sudbury. She looked at Simone with a specific kind of love that I had been watching my whole life. "We always knew you would." Everyone raised their glasses. My grandmother raised hers too, and I did the same because I was happy for Simone, genuinely. She had worked hard. It wasn't her fault that the love in this house had always been rationed. My mother's eyes drifted to me as glasses came down. "And Hazel," she said with a slightly different tone, "warmer maybe, but the kind of warm that covers something else, is keeping busy. She has her little cleaning business." She smiled at my aunt. "You know how Hazel is. She's always been more practical than ambitious." The table moved on. Someone asked Patrick about insurance rates, and he was off. My cousin started a story about Calgary winters. My mother got up to check the roast. I sat there. I want to describe what that moment felt like, because it wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was something older than anger. It was this specific feeling of being erased by someone who loves you, which is different from being erased by an enemy. An enemy you can fight. A mother who smiles at you while she does it. That's something you just have to sit with. My grandmother's hand found mine under the table. She didn't say anything. She just held on. Little cleaning business. That was what she'd said. We had 23 employees. We held contracts with 3 commercial property management firms in Simcoe County. We had just signed a deal with a mid-size hotel group that was opening a new location in Collingwood. I had turned down a partnership offer from a larger company in Toronto because I didn't want to give up equity. My accountant had told me in October that we were on track for our best year yet. Little cleaning business. I ate my dinner. I listened to Patrick explain the difference between term and whole life. I helped clear plates when my mother asked. I did everything that was expected of me. And I said nothing. Not yet. It was after dessert that my aunt brought it up again. There'd been wine, more than usual, and the table had gotten loose and easy in that way that only happens at certain family dinners. My uncle was telling a story about a fishing trip. My grandmother was dozing lightly in her chair. "Hazel," my aunt said, reaching for the last of the shortbread, Do you ever think about doing something else? Like, long term? You're still young. You could go back to school. I looked at her. I thought about all the times I had deflected this. All the times I had said, oh, maybe we'll see. I'm figuring it out. The years I had spent in a separate compartment from this family, building something real, something that had other people's mortgages attached to it, because 23 people depended on those contracts being renewed, and none of the people at this table knew any of it. I'm not sure what you mean by something else, I said. The business is doing pretty well. My aunt smiled patiently. I just mean in terms of a career, something with more stability. We're projected to clear $800,000 in revenue this year, I said. The table went quiet. Not all at once. It was my cousin's husband who stopped first, mid-sentence about something, and then my cousin, and then my aunt, who had the shortbread halfway to her mouth. My mother looked at me from the other end of the table. 800,000, my uncle said. Not a question, exactly. We have 23 employees, I said. Mostly full-time. We just signed a contract with a hotel group. They're opening in Collingwood in March. That's a 3-year agreement. Simone was looking at her wine glass. My mother had not moved. I thought you were, my aunt started and then didn't finish. Cleaning houses, I said. I was, 8 years ago. Then I started a company. The thing about a table going silent is that it isn't really silent. You can hear the refrigerator. You can hear someone swallow. My uncle cleared his throat. My cousin looked at her phone, then put it down. My mother said very carefully, you never told me any of this. I told you I ran a company, I said. You asked me once if it was going anywhere. I said yes. You asked me if I thought about going back to school. She opened her mouth, closed it. My grandmother, who I thought was asleep, said from her chair, without opening her eyes, she told me. Everyone looked at her. We talked about it at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, my grandmother said mildly. She drove me back to Aurelia. We talked the whole way. She did open her eyes then and looked at my mother with a calm, very clear expression. I asked her not to make a big announcement about it. I said the work would speak for itself eventually. She reached over and patted my hand. It did. The conversation after that was strange. My uncle asked questions, real ones, about the business model, about how the commercial contracts worked. My cousin said she hadn't known. That was amazing. Patrick said he had a client in facilities management, asked if I had a card. My mother was quiet for a long time. She helped clear the table without her usual commentary. She made tea and brought it out and set it down and didn't meet my eyes. It was almost 10 when most people had gone or were getting coats. My grandmother was waiting for her ride back to Aurelia. I was in the kitchen, putting the last of the dishes away, when my mother came in. She stood in the doorway for a moment. I didn't know, she said. I know you didn't. Why didn't you tell me? I thought about how to answer that. There were a lot of answers. I could have said, because every time I tried to tell you something, you found a way to make it smaller. I could have said, because you introduced me tonight as having a little cleaning business, and that was after you found out I owned a company. I could have said, because I got tired of being the other one. I said, I wasn't sure you'd be interested. She flinched. Just slightly. Hazel, I'm not angry, I said. And I meant it. I had burned through the anger years ago, somewhere around year 3 of the business, when I'd realized I didn't need her to believe in it for it to be real. I just got used to figuring things out on my own. She was quiet for a long moment. Your grandmother always said you were the one to watch, she said finally. It came out like something that cost her something. I know, I said. She told me that too. I finished putting the dishes away. I said goodnight to everyone still in the living room. I hugged my grandmother for a long time by the front door, and she held on in that way of hers and said nothing, which was everything. I drove back to Collingwood alone. The highway was empty, just the dark and the snow on either side and the occasional set of headlights coming the other way. I had a podcast queued up, but I didn't play it. I just drove. I thought about what my grandmother had said. that she'd told me the work would speak for itself eventually. She'd been right. I hadn't planned for that dinner to go the way it did. I hadn't walked in with a speech prepared, hadn't orchestrated the moment. I'd just gotten tired, in the middle of a meal, of making myself smaller to fit the space my family had decided I should occupy. What I said didn't make 14 people go silent. There were 9 of us at that table, but it made every one of them stop for a moment and reconsider something they had already decided. That was enough. I want to say something to whoever is watching this, because I know some of you have been at that table. Not that exact table. Yours might have been a different holiday, a different house, a different name they put on you without asking. Maybe it was the one who didn't finish school, or the one who took the unusual path, or the one who was just always, somehow, easier to overlook. You don't need to wait for a big moment. You don't need the revelation to be planned. You just have to keep building the thing you're building, quietly and seriously, for yourself first. The people who matter will find out eventually, and the ones who only come around once they know, well, you'll know what to do with that information. I'm not estranged from my mother. I want to say that because I know people will ask. We talk on Sundays now, differently than before. She asks real questions. She doesn't always know what to do with the answers, but she asks. That's something. My grandmother called me on New Year's Day. She said she was proud of me and that she had been for a long time and that some people take longer to see what's right in front of them. Then she asked me to describe the hotel contract in detail because she had always been interested in how deals worked. So I told her everything, all the way from the beginning, and she listened to every word. I used to think the hardest thing about being overlooked was the loneliness of it. But sitting in my car on that highway back to Collingwood, snow coming down soft on either side, I realized the hardest thing isn't being invisible. It's what you decide to do with it. For years, I made a choice that I didn't fully understand at the time. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was. I stopped sending updates home that nobody asked for. I stopped waiting for my mother's tone to change before I allowed myself to take my own work seriously. That choice felt like giving up for a long time. It wasn't. It was the most honest thing I ever did for myself. What happened at that Christmas table wasn't something I planned. But it wasn't random either. It was the result of 8 years of getting up early, of learning contracts, of building something real with Deb beside me, of making decisions nobody in that house knew I was capable of making. You reap what you actually put in, not what people imagine you're putting in, not what they're willing to credit you for. What you actually do, day after day, quietly, without applause. That's what shows up eventually. It always does. My grandmother understood something that took me longer to learn. She told me the work would speak for itself. She was right, but I think what she was really saying was something deeper, that integrity doesn't need an audience, that doing things the right way, treating your employees fairly, honoring your commitments, paying back your loans early because you said you would. That's not strategy. That's just who you're deciding to be. And the person you decide to be has a way of catching up with you in rooms where people thought they already knew the answer. I was never the smartest person in any room. I want to say that honestly. Simone is genuinely brilliant. But I learned early that being smart isn't the same as being willing to think carefully about a problem until you find the actual solution. I read every contract twice. I asked questions I was embarrassed to ask. I sat with my accountant for 2 hours going over numbers I didn't fully understand until I did. That kind of steady, patient thinking, the kind that doesn't look impressive from the outside, built everything I have. And the staying power. That's the part nobody talks about. The third year, when 2 of our biggest clients didn't renew and Deb and I sat at my kitchen table in January figuring out if we could make payroll, I didn't quit. Not because I was fearless, but because I had made a decision about who I was going to be and quitting didn't fit that person. You find out what you're made of. Not when things are going well, but when they're going badly and you show up anyway. Hazel, the maid. Hazel, who's between things. Hazel, who cleans houses. I drove home in the dark, And I thought, let them catch up. I've got work to do.